Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our next session of the cycle on Jewish languages of the Institut des Langues Rares of École Pratique des Hautes Études and INALCO. Our today's speaker is Professor Geoffrey Khan. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Maury Berabi, my master and my teacher. Geoffrey Khan is Regius Professor of Hebrew at the University of Cambridge. His research publications focus on three main fields: biblical Hebrew language, and especially its medieval traditions, Neo-Aramaic dialectology, and medieval Arabic documents. He is the general editor of the Encyclopedia of Hebrew Language and Linguistics, and is the senior editor of Journal of Semitic Studies. He is the author of dozens of books and many articles. His most recent book is The Tiberian Pronunciation Tradition of Biblical Hebrew, published in 2020. Geoffrey, the screen is all yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to present in this series of talks about Jewish languages, which is an incredibly interesting series and very important to bring all these languages together, I think, because they often are not brought together in such a way. So I'm going to share my screen now. Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to talk to you about the Aramaic-speaking Jews who used to live in Iraq and Iran. First of all, I'm going to sort of just give just in a couple of minutes a very brief overview of Aramaic, which probably is not necessary for this audience, but the main point I want to make is that Aramaic has had many centuries of documentation. It's probably one of the earliest documented, or not only one of the earliest documented languages, but one of the languages with the longest continuous documentation. I mean, it's the earliest forms of it go back to inscriptions about 1000 BC, and it's been continuously documented in various written forms through to modern times. Now, in antiquity, it was very widespread in the Achaemenid period, in the middle of the first millennium BCE. It was the lingua franca of a vast area of Western Asia, including, you see this on the map here, essentially, right across Iran to Afghanistan and across Mesopotamia, and also Egypt for a certain period of time. And it's, as I say, it's attested from ancient inscriptions, and then in various forms of documentation continuously for many centuries. This is actually a document found in Afghanistan recently from the Achaemenid period. Incantation bowls, various forms of Syriac. Now, as you see, I won't go into any details here because this is not the subject of my talk, but you see this form of Aramaic is attested in various scripts. And of course, there is a major split between the script which is used by Jews, certainly from the first millennium CE onwards, and those in the script used by Christians. So this is a Christian document written in Syriac, and this is a Jewish document. This is a Targum, a Jewish Aramaic Bible translation written in Hebrew script. Aramaic, as I said, in the Achaemenid period was very widely spoken, and it was essentially the main vernacular language of most of Mesopotamia and Syria. From the Islamic period onwards, there was a gradual loss of Aramaic as a spoken language. Certainly, it was really from the middle of the first millennium CE when, with the rise of Islam, gradually other languages supplanted Aramaic as the vernacular, mainly, of course, Arabic in the core sort of Islamic empire. But Aramaic as a spoken vernacular language has survived down to this day in 4 main subgroups, which are normally referred to as Central Neo-Aramaic, Northeastern Neo-Aramaic, Neo-Mandaic, and Western Neo-Aramaic. Now, here you can see roughly the location of these four subgroups. Now, Neo-Mandaic is down here in south western Iran. Western Neo-Aramaic is here in the region of Damascus in three villages, Ma'alula, Jub'adin, and Baqa. Central Neo-Aramaic is here in the Tur Abdin region of southeastern Turkey. And over the Tigris River, which you can't see very clearly in this map, we have this so-called Northeastern Neo-Aramaic dialect subgroup, which is a very diverse subgroup of over 150 dialects spoken in northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and western Iran, all the way down the border down to roughly level with Baghdad on the western borderland of Iraq. In antiquity, as I said, before the Islamic period, the Aramaic was widely spoken across this whole area. So these are four language islands. We could say that these are surviving islands which have survived, whereas, in between these islands, the speakers have shifted, undergone a so-called linguistic shift, a language shift to other languages. Essentially in this area, of course, it's Arabic. It's mainly this area where I'm pointing to with the cursor. In antiquity, however, we can trace various boundaries between the various forms of Aramaic spoken, and one of them was here on the Tigris River, which was a political boundary between, well, first of all...
Dobra, oczywiście, tak.
Yeah,
Tak. Idź. Z tym, że chyba jest zamknięte.
Yeah,
No idź sama.
I think you better mute yourselves.
Henrik, please mute yourself.
Yeah. So,
sorry.
So there were political boundaries between for example, between the Byzantines and Sasanians. The Tigris River was a political boundary. Also, in late antiquity, it was a religious boundary between the two forms of Christianity. It was the Jacobite Syrian Orthodox Christianity towards the west of the Tigris, and towards the east it was the Nestorian Church of the East. And so these ancient political and religious boundaries are, although certainly not certainly not the ancient political boundary, but certainly this history of boundary between religion and politics has actually survived to this day. At least is reflected to this day, I should say, in this major split between the Central Neo-Aramaic dialects and the Nina dialects, because really these two dialect groups are actually contiguous with each other essentially, but there are considerable differences between them, and it seems as if these differences are very ancient roots, and they go back to this ancient political and religious division. And so this is just an example how looking at the modern language situation can actually reflect ancient sort of politics, if you like. Now, one of the most, I'm going to be talking about the Nina group, the so-called Northeastern Neo-Aramaic dialects, which I refer to, it's normally abbreviated to the acronym NENA, N-E-N-A. And this is the dialect group I've been studying for many years. And this is the dialect group which contains the Jewish dialects. The Jews who speak Aramaic all speak so-called Nina dialects. So they all were originally from northern Iraq, southeastern Iran, or southeastern Turkey, western Iran. Now, one of the most interesting features of this Nina group is that there's a so-called communal dialect split. That is to say, the speakers are either Christian or Jewish, but the Christians and Jews speak very different dialects, despite even in places where they're essentially living in the same place, I mean, in the same town or the same region, the Jews and Christians spoke very different dialects. And this, as we would have seen from many of the talks in this series already, this is a very common feature of Jewish languages, is that they differ in structure from their, the languages of the non-Christian sort of neighbors. And it reflects the role of communal identity in the historical development of languages. Now, just to give you a quick example of how dialects can differ through this communal dialect split, we can take a look at two dialects from essentially from the same town. This is the town of Urmi in northwestern Iran. We have Christians and Jews speaking the Aramaic, and their dialects are really very different in all levels of language, in phonology, morphology, syntax, and lexicon. I mean, perhaps I won't go through all these details here, but just to give you a quick example, the Christians would say beta for house, which goes back originally to baithar, which is the older form of Aramaic, whereas the Jews would say bela, which would be essentially, there are two features different there. First of all, that the Christians have a T where there was an ancient interdental th, whereas the Jews have an L, a lateral. Also, the Christians have penultimate stress, beta, whereas the Jews have final stress, bela. Also, that's in phonology, we have different morphological forms for phenomenal suffixes. Word order, basic word order is distinct. The Christians would have verb object basic word order, where the Jews would have OV basic word order. And then there's the numerous differences in the basic lexicon as well. Now, the this is a map of the Nina dialect area, and this sort of shows the area where the Jewish dialects were spoken. Now, at this point, I have to emphasize that we are talking about the situation before the middle of last century, because until the middle of last century, until the early 1950s, there were thriving Jewish communities across all this area, essentially from, across northern Iraq, western Iran, and southeastern Turkey. However, in the early 1950s, virtually all the Jews left this area. They went to the newly founded state of Israel. And so to this day, the surviving speakers of Jewish Aramaic most of them can be found in Israel. A number of the communities from Iran stayed on after the 1950s to the 1970s, but certainly the vast majority of the Aramaic-speaking Jews left Iran after the Islamic Khomeini revolution in the late 1970s. So, and these Iranian Aramaic-speaking Jews mainly either moved to Israel, or many of them actually went to California, actually. So in California, there are a number of Aramaic-speaking Jews from Iran now. However, all of these dialects are now are severely endangered because of the fact that the communities have essentially moved to a different language, nation states where different languages are spoken, and they are rapidly losing their language, and only very old speakers, really old people now can speak fluently the dialects, and many of the dialects have actually become extinct. In fact, since I've been working on them, many of them have become extinct. Now, I'll perhaps just quickly mention the fact that in Cambridge we're producing a very large database and dialect atlas in which we are making accessible all knowledge about the various Nina dialects, both Jewish and Christian. And this is a database which is accessible It's still under construction, but it's still a very good way of getting direct access to the dialects. Now, let me just talk you through some of the main places where the Jews were found who speak Aramaic. Now, they were found in, perhaps I'll go back to the map here so we can see they're found in essentially ranging places like Zacho, Ahmadiyya, where up here, in fact, I've got some pictures of it, so I'll just show you. Zacho is in the northwestern corner of Iraq. There was a large Jewish community there, and here are just a few old pictures of some from the Aramaic-speaking Jews from Zacho. Then there was a community in Ahmadiyya, this beautiful sort of hilltop town in northern Iraq, and here we have an old photograph of a synagogue in the 1940s in Ahmadiyya. Of course, all this has now been abandoned. Up in the north east of Iraq, there was a community up in a place called Ruandus, right up in the mountains, a very beautiful place. A very small community there, but here we have some old pictures of Jews of Ruandus. Now, in all of these places I'm mentioning, they spoke a different dialect. So although the Jews of Rwanda, for example, was only a very small community, they spoke quite a different dialect from dialects elsewhere. Suleymaniye is a town found in the Ottoman period. There was a large Jewish community there who spoke a very distinct dialect. And Sanandaj, there was a community in Western Iran who spoke again a distinct dialect. This is the map again. We see some of these places I've been mentioning. So we can see essentially it's an area going from northern Iraq all the way down, right down from northwestern Iran, ultimately all the way down to Kerend is the lowest point where Aramaic Jews were to be found. And indeed, and Khanaqin, to this day, there are reports, in fact, I know for certain that there are Jews still in this area of Western Iran who speak Aramaic. I think they came from Khanaqin, so there are still some Jews left. There were Jews in Bijar, that's I think the most easterly, the eastern boundary of Neo-Aramaic, the Jewish community Bijar, who spoke a dialect very similar to Sanandaj, actually. There were Jews up in this area, just north of Ahmadiyya. I mentioned Ahmadiyya, but just north of that, there was a village known as Bet Anure, where there was a Jewish community and this is unlike most other Jews, these Jews of Bet Anure were agriculturalists. So one of the points I'd like to make about the professions of the Jews was that they were actually, most Jews were living in towns and that were practicing trade essentially, or sometimes weaving or various crafts. But only a small minority of the Jews, Aramaic-speaking Jews, were agriculturalists. And one such agricultural community was Bet Anure, that's in the far north of Iraq, north of Ahmadiyya. And these are some photographs of the synagogue I took a few years ago when I was in Iraq, quite a small synagogue. Here's another picture of Rustaka. This is a place way up in the mountains near the Turkish-Iranian border, where there was a small community, again speaking a very distinct dialect. So here's the map again. Okay, yeah, so the point is that some of the Jews from this area actually left the area before the 1950s, or as early as the 19th century. For example, many of the Jews of Salamas went north into the Caucasus, and they actually, in 1950, Stalin moved them from Tbilisi to Almaty in Kazakhstan. And this is the picture of Almaty. And to this day, well, I went to Almaty a few years ago, and I found about 20 Jewish families speaking Aramaic. So here we can just hear one of these speakers quickly. Yeah, so there was a small community still left to this day in Kazakhstan, thanks to Stalin, basically. Now, most of the Jews of southeastern Turkey were essentially Aramaic-speaking Jews of southeastern Turkey have essentially disappeared, and until about 3 or 4 years ago, it was thought that many of the dialects spoken by the Jews of southeastern Turkey are extinct and have become extinct without documentation. Now, one of such towns is where Jews was Bashkele in southeastern Turkey. Now, but just by chance, it came to my attention. Through various networks, I discovered that in fact there is still to this day a family from Bashkele, a Jewish family living in Istanbul. And I rushed to Istanbul. It was about 3 years ago now, and I found this Jewish family. So I found this family who was still speaking, at least the elderly people in the family, basically the grandmother and grandfather, were still speaking the Aramaic dialect. So a dialect which I thought was extinct, suddenly I found what probably is the final 2 speakers of this dialect. Now here's a quick video of her speaking. Yeah, so although these dialects are highly endangered, one can't be absolutely certain they're extinct sometimes. Sometimes they end up by being still, but one can still find the odd surviving speaker. Now, the reason why it's such a tragedy that the dialects are becoming extinct is that the vast majority of these dialects were only vernaculars. And it was only written down occasionally, and certain dialects were written down, Jewish dialects were written down, only a very small number of them. And this started to happen in some communities in the Ottoman period, in this 17th century, essentially. So here's an example of a basically, so this is a homily, a midrash, basically written in a form of Jewish Aramaic from up in the near the so-called up in northern Iraq. It's a sort of combination of Zaho and Nerwa, basically. Now, the point is that I should have mentioned that the fact that there's so many Jewish dialects and there's so many Christian dialects, there's massive linguistic diversity, is a reflection of the fact that these dialects are incredibly ancient. Because when you get linguistic diversity, it's a reflection of antiquity. So essentially, the Jewish dialects, and as indeed the Christian dialects, are survivals of the Aramaic of antiquity. And this goes back, therefore, the Aramaic-speaking Jews must go back to communities who were speaking Aramaic way back, in the pre-Islamic period. So their diversity is as I say, a reflection of this antiquity. Now, but in terms of the relationship between these various Jewish dialects, if we take the Jewish dialects first, which is of course our main focus this evening, they can be classified into 2 broad groups, and there's a group of dialects which is west of the Zab River, and this is referred to generally as Lishana Dani. This literally means our language, because this is just the particularly distinctive feature of this group. Dani is the sort of first plural genitive particle, which is distinctive of this group. So this includes dialects such as Zaho, Ahmadiyya, Dohok, for example. The other main dialect group are the dialects spoken across the Zab River, so in the so-called Trans-Zab dialects. That means all the Jewish dialects east of the Zab River, basically, all these dialects, Rustaka, Ruandos, Urmi, Sanandaj, Kerend, all of those, and Sulamania, all the Trans-Zab dialects. And they're very distinct in structure. We'll touch on this very briefly at some point, but I mean, essentially the Trans-Zab dialects have undergone a greater assimilation to, or greater convergence with the Iranian languages with which they were in contact. But even the Lishana Dani dialects, I mean, although the Lishana Dani dialects have undergone less convergence with the languages in contact, and therefore, in many respects, they are more archaic in their structure than the Trans-Zab dialects. They are still very distinct from the Christian dialects of the same region. So if you take the Christian dialects in the so-called Lishana Dani area, such as on the left column we have Barwar, which is a dialect spoken by Christians near Betanure, actually, just over the fields from Betanure. And I mean, I won't go through all these lists, but basically, in morphology and in lexicon, there is considerable difference from the Lishana Dani Jewish dialects. Whereas, these Lishana Dani Jewish dialects from Zahwa, Media, Nerwa, are in fact are all quite similar to each other. And this, by the way, reflects an interesting feature, is that although some of these places are quite geographically, they're quite distinct. I mean, there's quite long distances, certainly before modern transport. It would take some time to travel from Ahmadiyya to Nerwa, for example. They are still very, very close in structure, which would suggest that there were quite tight social networks among the Jews across quite large sort of geographical distances. And so essentially, the driving factor for the distinctiveness of the Jewish dialects from the Christian dialects was different social networks. I mean, language change is fueled by these sociological factors. But an interesting fact is that, these social networks of the Jews would actually extend over large geographical areas. Now, the Christians also, I mean, the Jews, of course, I've just said, have all left Iraq in the early 1950s. But the Christian dialects also underwent considerable decimation, and certainly are now also in a state of endangerment due to various forced migrations of the Aramaic-speaking Christians, really since it all started in 1915 in massacres of the Syrian Christians in Eastern Turkey during the Ottoman period, or the end of the Ottoman period, I should say, in the First World War, where masses, the whole population essentially of Hakkari in southeastern Turkey was either massacred or driven into exile. And this devastation has really, all these upheavals have continued over the last 100 years, essentially. These are just some pictures of 1915 of these refugees from Hakkari. A few other communities did return to some areas of Turkey. This is pictures of some people in the Judi area, and that's in Judi Mountain in southeastern Turkey. But these people all left, though, in the 1970s, essentially, because there were these wars between Turks and the Kurds in Iraq. In Iraqi Saddam Hussein, there's massive sort of conflict, and they all left. So then they're all now, well, most of them from the Judi area are actually in France or in Belgium. So those who, if you like, some of the kind of the refugees from these various sort of upheavals settled outside of the immediate Nina area. For example, many Christians settled in Georgia. Here just some pictures of Aramaic speaking Christians I met in Georgia. This is me recording one of them. But then in 2015, this is 100 years after the massacres of 1915, there was the invasion of ISIS into northern Iraq, and they devastated many of the Christian communities there. And that drove out many of the Christian population, which means that now the Nina Christian dialects are endangered as well. So there's a massive, reduction in the population. I mean, 1.4 million is now reduced down to as much as under 250,000. Anyhow, now let's look at the relationship between the Aramaic-speaking Jews and their Muslim neighbors. Well, as I said, the Jews were essentially, Aramaic-speaking Jews essentially lived in towns. There were small traders, goldsmiths, tailors, weavers, and dyers. And they had very close contact with the Iranian urban population, and the dialects were heavily influenced by Iranian languages, by Kurdish, but also by a language known as Gorani, which is now becoming clear, but had a big impact on Nina, but now is only itself spoken in a few pockets. In fact, I'm working at the moment with on a project with Masoud Mohammed Daraj. I think he's listening in this evening, on showing, showing actually what the impact of Gorani was on Nina. So if we just go back to that chart of the Urmi dialects, see some of the differences we see here between, like, the phonology, Bela, for example, versus Beta, or basic word order, OV, in the Jewish dialect. Both of those features seem to be due to greater convergence with the Iranian languages, without going into any details, but that is a reflection of this greater convergence. And not only was is this close relationship between the Jewish dialects and the Muslim Iranian dialects reflected in the linguistic structure, but also attestations of Jewish Aramaic speakers themselves when I've recorded them in my fieldwork. I've recorded just quickly. We can go through some of the statements I recorded them from my informants. For example, one of the Jews from Suleymaniya, when I asked him about relations between Jews and Muslims, he said this is in translation, of course. He said, in our community, the Muslims were very good. For example, if you were going to Baghdad and in the train you saw a Jew, you saw him together with a Muslim, the Muslim, would make him sit by him. He would speak with him and say kind words to him, and they would sit together. And suckling of Jewish babies by Muslim neighbors was very frequent, resulting in a strong milk bonds. So which were essentially considered as strong as blood bonds. And the following was narrated to me by a Jew from Arbel this is Erbil, as it is which they call it in Arabic. So the mother of this Muslim, Wahid, gave me milk when I was an infant, and my mother gave milk to him. If a Muslim sucked milk together with me and I sucked milk together with him, they are considered to be brothers. There was no difference whether he was a Muslim or a Jew, they were brothers. And many Muslims expressed sadness when the Jews left the region in the 1950s, as reported by a Jewish woman who grew up in a village on the Arbel plain. His grandfather, he was just pointing to one of the people in the group, his grandfather was in charge of all the supplies for the army. He used to sell them to a certain Muslim. When we came to Israel, he, the Muslim, came in a train and wept. He pleaded with him. He said, don't go. The Muslim wept for his grandfather. He said, no, don't go. So, relationship between the Aramaic-speaking Jews and their Christian neighbors. Now, the linguistic differences between the dialects of Jews and the dialects of the Christians reflect the fact that these communities constitute two different social networks and identity groups. That's the important point, as I've mentioned before. And as I've mentioned, these social networks extended over considerable distances. So as I just sort of, I won't go over that again because I already mentioned it, but basically, you get Jewish dialects from, say, Zachor, Amedia, Dohok, and further, all the way up to the Zav zone, were very similar to each other. And dialects from, say, I don't know, from Arbel, Rwanda's Rustaka, Suleimania, Sanandaj, all of those do exhibit quite a lot of common features. Now, the Nina dialects, however, exhibit signs of social contact between Christian and Jewish communities. And this is reflected by the phenomenon of shared linguistic innovations in both Christian and Jewish dialects in the same region. So the point is that when you get changes in two languages, which are shared, these essentially originate in two ways. They either originate from the fact that these two languages were originally one language and that the speakers split, or they can develop through contact, through convergence, through contact. And contact means bilingualism, essentially, because contact is not just simply physical contact, it's actually communication, interaction, social interaction, and desire to communicate. All of those things motivate bilingualism, and therefore, if you get shared features between Christian and Jewish dialects, which of the same area, that reflects the fact that there must have been some degree of social interaction and social sense of a certain degree of a shared social network. So, just very briefly here, we've got a couple of examples of how in Khoisanjak, which is in the so-called Trans-Zab area of eastern Iraq, we get a progressive construction formed by a little particle la, which is ultimately, it seems to be a copula in origin. And that's also shared by the Jewish Khoisanjak dialect. But in both cases, this is an innovation from earlier Aramaic, but it's a shared innovation. Christian in the Lishan Adani area, where we have Jewish Barwa Beta Nure, with that little village I mentioned before, they have a construction to express the progressive with a prefixed copula followed by an infinitive. I should say la is combined with basically a present verb form, whereas the progressive in Barwar area, Christian and Jewish, is formed by copula plus an infinitive. I mean, without going into any details, I mean, the point is that these are similar, two clusters of similar constructions, and therefore the fact you get this convergence between the Jewish and Christian dialects must be interpreted as a reflection of some degree of convergence of social networks, basically. Now, this is Barwar. Unfortunately, it's really now empty of empty of the Jewish population who are in Beta Nure, this village, but also most of the Christians have now left because it's on the Turkish border, and there's a lot of very unsettled border, and there's a lot of bombing going on there at the moment. In fact, I've been there, but this is a photograph I took, but it's this is about 2017. I went back in 2019, and there was bombing going on there, so I couldn't get there, I'm afraid. But here are just some of these are really some of the reconstructed villages, some of the Christians who try to return. There's Bishmiai, here's Betanuri again. But the point is, I mentioned this issue about social networks and between Christians and Jews as reflected in the languages, the dialects. Now, I work very closely with Christians from Barwar, and they Hezimud Safi in Israel did a very detailed documentation of the Betanuri dialects. So, between us, we've essentially fully documented all the sort of Nina dialects of Barwar. But it's very interesting to, apart from the actual linguistic sort of relationship is the text which we've recorded and the interviews we've made of the speakers reflects a very close relationship, social relationship between the Jews and the Christians, which confirms this theory of a social network reflected by the languages. For example, I mean, one of my informants from Barwa, the Christian villages, would tell me that when he was a child, he would run over the fields to Betanure and sit by the knees of the rabbi in Betanure and listen to stories being told to the Jewish children there. So, you know, the Jewish and the Christian children would all listen to stories together. There was a shrine of Elijah in Betanure, and this was visited by Jews. Not obviously, it was originally the guardians of it were the Jews, but it was visited by the Christians and also by the Muslims. Even when the Jews left in the 1950s, you know, the shrine was preserved for some years by the local Christians. And when Jews or Christians refer to each other, they use this term in Aramaic, qariwa, which literally means near person, you know, or kinsman. Somebody very closely, emotionally very close. It's a term in Christian Aramaic it's used, for example, to refer to the best man at a wedding as well, to show you that degree of social nearness. So this is used as a term of address when a Christian would refer to a Jew he'd refer to a Jew as a qariwa. Despite the fact that there's a lot of linguistic and also other evidence for this very close social relationship, the Jews still had a distinct community identity, of course. And one of the ways in which this was reflected is the fact that they actually had a sort of list or inventory of cryptic words, a sort of like secret language, which they used to ensure that Christians didn't understand certain things. Now, Christians and Jews would have obviously spoken to each other, as I was saying, in Aramaic. And what seems to have happened is that the Jews would speak Jewish Aramaic and the Christians Christian Aramaic, and gradually their dialects did begin to converge in the ways I've explained. But the Jews did put barriers, linguistic barriers, as well, to maintain a distinct community identity. And this was actually done by the strategy of secret language, which and final point I'd like to make is about, I mentioned quite a lot about issues of language contact, and many languages had an impact on the Aramaic dialects. And these languages in contact seem to, well, the convergence with many of these languages in contact is greater in some dialects than others. And I've explained that certainly in the Trans-Zab Jewish dialect, there was a much greater convergence with the Iranian languages of the region, it seems, than is the case with the Lishana Dani Jewish dialects. Also, those Trans-Zab Jewish dialects have converged more with the Iranian language than virtually all the Christian dialects. Now, one of the reasons, as I mentioned, why the Jewish dialects tended to converge more with Iranian is because of the social situation was, the Jews tend to be in smaller urban communities, more intense contact with the Muslim population. Whereas the Christians tended to be out in villages, sort of agriculturalists who were in not such intense contact. But all Nina dialects underwent some convergence with the Iranian in various ways. In the various dialects of Kurdish, whether the Kurmanji, Sorani. Also with Gorani at an earlier period, it seems, but also with Armenian, Arabic, Turkic languages, and Persian to some extent. So all of those were languages which are in contact. You notice these are a mixture of different language families. I mean, you know, obviously Arabic is Semitic, but we have Armenian, Indo-European, and the rest, and Turkic, of course, is Turkic. Persian, Armenian, and Kurdish are different, are Indo-European, and Kurdish and Persian are Iranian, obviously. But so they all had an impact in certain ways. I mean, and it's perhaps I haven't got time to go into more details about this impact, but perhaps just two quick points about language contact and Nina. One of them is this, that there's a so-called historical layering of contact languages. So in central Kurdistan region, for example, there seems to have been a language shift in Iranian at some point in history between Gorani and Sorani, for example. And it very often features of Nina, and this is what in my project with Masood, I'm finding that many of the features of Nina, which seem to have, particularly Jewish Nina, which seem to have developed through contact with Iranian, are actually resulted in a convergence with an earlier layer of Iranian, which has now essentially disappeared except for a few pockets. And so when we talk about language contact, we have to be careful about establishing what layer of history we're talking about. And in fact, indeed, this sort of historical layering can go even deeper, because we've got, even in certain, particularly Christian dialects, there are traces of Akkadian in the lexicon, which must have, of course, that is now extinct as a spoken language. But the influence or the impact of a language in contact happened at a very deep historical layer, and that's now gone. But this is the same with Gorani and Sorani. Also in the Urmi region, Kurdish was historically had a great impact, but over the last few centuries, Turkic has become more predominant as the vernacular of the Muslim population in the Urmi region. And so Turkic has had a great influence on Urmi dialects, including the Jewish dialects. But the point is that if you dig deep into the dialects, you see, in fact, it's a lot of the features have developed through an early historical layer. So there's that feature. The other thing about language contact that I'd say briefly was the fact that some language contact, certainly with Arabic, which is another Semitic language, of course, can result not in change, but in actually prevention or constraint against change. Because, and this applies, for example, in the pronunciation, the phonology. For example, the fact that some of those Nina dialects in the region of Mosul, and the Mosul plain, preserve the interdental consonants like th, the, is due to the fact that they were in contact with Arabic, because the Arabic dialects of that region in Mosul, for example, have interdental consonants. Whereas the Nina dialects further to the east, away from the Arabic-speaking areas, they lost their interdentals and replaced them by various like stops or laterals, like we've seen, like that Bela we saw was a result of convergence with Iranian languages due to the so-called weakness, or the Zagros D. It's actually all goes back to a weak pronunciation of dental consonant. So, I mean, in conclusion, I'd say that when one's looking at the Nina dialects, and specifically the Jewish Nina dialects, looking at the linguistic structure, I mean, looking at it from a point of view of a linguist, like I am, rather than a historian, and looking at the relationships between dialects and the various historical relationships with languages in contact, can tell us a great deal about the history of these communities. I mean, communities which do not have written records and don't have much of a sort of communal memory either. But the languages really are the key historical evidence for the history of a lot of these communities, both in terms of migration history, social sort of history, contact with earlier language layers. So that's incredibly important, not only for linguists, but also for generally for Jewish history, if you like, and of course for Christian dialects are important for Christian history. but just beyond that, because it's also important for all minority communities of the region, because of course many of the thing I didn't touch on, but I mean, many of the Jews appear to have converted to Islam over the centuries, and therefore, the kind of certainly the ethnic relationship in that region is quite complex. And to this day, I mean, certain Jews, even since the 1950s, have converted. Some Jews, for example, remained in Iraq after 1950s and converted to Islam, mainly women, actually. So the one conclusion, just like today, studying linguistics is very important for history. And finally, I'd say that, these languages are incredibly endangered, and we still need to have documentation done of many of them. And we only really have a few years left for this to be done. And so this is a common situation with Jewish languages, is that, that we're at this point in time when we really have to really do focused documentation of the spoken vernaculars, and to preserve records for generations to come. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.